All right, welcome to everyone who's just joining us. We're going to give a minute or two for everybody to get online. This is the Southern California Water Dialogue, February 28th. And this is Connor Everts, co-chair. All right, everybody, we're just waiting for everybody to get online for a couple minutes, and then we're going to get started with the Southern California Water Dialogue. Welcome. Okay, everyone, this is February 28th, the Southern California Water Dialogue. Our subject is, as the skies open up, are we taking advantage of all the rain? We've got an excellent lineup for you today. Gary, if we can go to the first slide. I am co-chair Connor Everts, Executive Director of the Southern California Dialogue with Dee Zink, who's Assistant General Manager, External Affairs, the Metropolitan Water District. Welcome, everybody. This is our steering committee, who I want to thank for every month coming up with a different subject. We'd also like, if you can as well, but I want to thank all the people listed here, especially Kathy Caldwell, who is our coordinator for the dialogue and makes it happen. Our ground rules for the webinar, so you won't be able to see people listed there, but if you have technical difficulties, use the chat feature to let us know. Joanne Carrillo is doing support for us, along with Gary Hansen. If you're going to ask a question, use the Q&A, not the chat. Type in your question, and then send. They'll be addressed after the presentations. If you have a poor connection, move closer to your router or turn off other service, including bandwidth. You can also turn off your video. The audio is muted for attendees by default till we get to, and the questions will actually be read. We run about 60 minutes of discussion and then followed by our dialogue or Q&A session afterwards. Again, how to answer a question. We're all pretty familiar with Zoom by now. You can also upvote questions. If you see them and you would like to see them read earlier or make a priority, you can upvote them. Again, Dee Zink will do the dialogue and concluding remarks at the end. Lineup today, speakers from across Southern California, including Mike Prather from the Owens Valley, Dan Denham, General Manager of the San Diego County Water Authority, and Eric Tillemans, from Assistant Aqueduct Manager for LADWP. And with that, I will turn it over to Dan. Thank you very much.
All right, good morning, everyone. My name is Dan Denham. I'm the General Manager at the San Diego County Water Authority. I believe most of you know that we provide most of the drinking water to San Diego County. So I appreciate the opportunity to talk to you all today. I kind of want to just give you an overview of how we've adapted to our region's changing needs over the course of the past 20 or 30 years. Myself, I've been at the Water Authority for, I'm going on 19 years now. Most of that has been cutting my teeth on Colorado River issues, but prior to that, I was in wastewater with the city of San Diego for 10 years or so. So let me start to share the story about where the Water Authority has been and where we're headed, which is really, I think, a tale of an evolution of our service area. Next slide, please. So we were formed about 80 years ago to provide a supplemental supply of water to San Diego County. We serve 3.3 million people in a $268 billion regional economy. We are, of course, a member of the Metropolitan Water District, one of 26. As you can see there, we're at the end of Met's service area. And the pipelines from Met go down about 6 miles into the Water Authority, which is where we take over our distribution system, which includes aqueducts, reservoirs, and about 310 miles of massive pipelines, really, that are responsible for our regional distribution system. And of course, our agency is responsible for the long-term water planning in San Diego County. Next slide, please. So just kind of a sense of how we shape up with our peers in the region. You can kind of see the graphic there, the comparison between rainfall in downtown Los Angeles and San Diego. We don't get much, nor do we have much groundwater. So little rainfall, very little groundwater compared to the rest of the country and even the Southwest. So I think that what all of that speaks to is forcing us to be a little bit more creative than most and try to think outside the box to bring water into the San Diego region. Next slide, please. So this kind of, this is the slide where it sort of starts the journey here. You know, since we joined Metropolitan, we were mainly in the 90s. Leading up to the 90s, we're mainly a pipeline agency, delivering almost exclusively imported water from Metropolitan into our service area. In the 80s and 90s, that changed quite a bit. It's really not too different than what we all experienced back in 2022 with severe drought and the curtailment. What started off with voluntary reduction headed into a rapid succession of mandatory reductions in the service area. And really, ultimately, what that got our board and our community to do was to react in a way to never let that sort of situation happen again. And so we embarked upon what has been about a 20-30 year process to diversify the Water Authority's supply portfolio. Our board directed a portfolio approach to ensure that we had not only sufficient supplies, but also made significant investments in infrastructure. We've adopted cutting edge conservation ethics and techniques. We've sponsored legislation at the state level. And we're at the forefront of many water use efficiency programs, including low flush toilets and many others. But really, I think what got us started off was this investment in a partnership with the Imperial Valley and the Metropolitan Water District. And that's a long-term water conservation agreement with the Imperial Valley and the transportation of that water to the Water Authority service area through Metropolitan. Those type of partnerships have continued and have been successful over the past 20 years. And those, along with the Carlsbad desal plant, which is about 10% of our region's supply, have put us really at about the $3 billion mark in terms of our investments. We've raised dams to the tune of $1 billion. The Carlsbad desal plant was $1 billion. The QSA across Southern California is a multi-billion-dollar enterprise. And then, of course, there's the ongoing pipeline relining and capital improvement program projects that we have to, like I said, keep our distribution system whole and running for the San Diego regional economy. Next slide, please. So I think the future of water for us in San Diego, like many in Southern California, is going to be focused on reuse projects. We're going to be bringing online within the next 15 years in partnership with our member agencies, nearly 100,000 acre-feet worth of new potable reuse supplies into the San Diego region. These, like I said, these projects are being implemented by our member agencies with support from the Water Authority, from Metropolitan, with funding some of these projects. And we look to expedite the development. The three you see on the screen here: Pure Water San Diego, Pure Water Oceanside, and the East County Advanced Water Purification Project, are all going to be coming online right around the same time in 2026, although a smaller component of Pure Water Oceanside is already online now. Next slide, please. So this is what our diversification looks like. This is 25 years worth of investment in resiliency. You see the donut graphics transitioning us from really, like I mentioned, an imported water agency with one source of supply to where we're at today, with a really diverse resource mix. We're going to continue to shore up some of these supplies, like I mentioned, with the reuse projects. That slice of the pie, if we go out 20 or so years, it's going to become an even bigger component of our supply portfolio. But you know, something else worth, I think, highlighting is the bar chart that you see there, and how efficient our region has become in using water. We've reduced per capita water use by more than 50% since 1990. And you know, although it's good for the region, it's a little tough on the bottom line in terms of sales, but that's something I think that all of us are going through, along with hydrology. So again, I think that we continue with this theme of trying to evolve and trying to think outside the box as to how we manage this going forward. Next slide, please. So we're all well aware of 2022, and as we headed into 2023, and I think some of my colleagues on this panel today will talk a little bit about this, but you know, we're dealing with climate whiplash. Coming out of 2022, the last year of the driest 3 years ever recorded, you know, I think everyone in Southern California was facing the likelihood of water supply restrictions. Again, 2023 hit, it's a different story. We forget about drought, but I think all of us on this panel and those of you tuning in today know that drought will be back. And I think that it's key. It goes without saying to stay focused as to how we look towards the future, and what a future drought may look like. Next slide, please. So in that regard, or in that vein, I really do think that the future of water in Southern California, of course, reuse is going to be a big component of it, but I do believe that a lot of it is going to have to do with sharing resources and developing partnerships to share those resources. Just at the end of 2023, the Water Authority signed a landmark agreement with the Metropolitan Water District and the Imperial Irrigation District that was made possible through funding from the federal government and equally important, an abundance of state water project supplies. In a nutshell, what we were able to do was take advantage of those high runoff years in Northern California, bringing that state water project water down to San Diego and leaving some of our Colorado River conserved water in Lake Mead, 50,000 acre-feet, which raised the reservoir by 6 inches. Could not have been done without a partnership that we have and relationships developed over time with the Metropolitan Water District and the Imperial Irrigation District. I look towards more of this to the future as we start to realize that as demands drop off, we're all experiencing, we're going to need a little bit more flexibility, optimizing our resource portfolio now and optimizing our financial resource mix in the future. I think it's front and center. It's probably the key to continued success for all of us in this water space. Next slide, please. So again, as we continue to evolve this flexible idea of optimizing supplies, what we would like to do is replicate what we did with our partners at MET and IID in 2023, heading into the 2026 time period. The basin states are negotiating how to bolster up Lake Mead and fortify the lower basin as the Colorado River starts to slowly rebound from drought. But like I said, I believe drought's here to stay, and planning for that in the future is kind of where I think we should all be. Last slide, please. That's really just a quick overview of things. I appreciate the ability to be here. Please keep in touch, and I will turn it over to Eric Tillmans, the Assistant Aqueduct Manager at LADWP.
Okay, thank you, Dan. Appreciate that. It was an interesting presentation there. We're going to get a little more specific on my presentation and Mike's right after this. We're just focusing on what happened last year along the Los Angeles Aqueduct System, and then Larones River a little bit later on. I've been working with aqueduct operations for about 21 years with Los Angeles Department of Water and Power, and the Los Angeles Aqueduct is one of the major water supplies to the city of LA. It, on average, produces about 30% of the water for the city of LA, although in wet years it's much higher, and in dry years it's much lower than that. Here you can see a picture of our Pleasant Valley Dam. Cascading down from the hillsides is rainwater. This happened in our March Rain on Snow event that I'll discuss a little bit later. And it's also spilling over the top through our spillway here into the Owens River. Next slide, please. As Dan talked about, and everyone was aware, last year was a record year in many places throughout the Western United States and California, and that includes the Eastern Sierra that supplies the water for Los Angeles Aqueduct. So our 2023 April 1st snowpack was 296% of normal. And our old record was 270%, and that happened in 1969. This photo you're looking at here is of Long Valley Reservoir and Long Valley Dam, which we have a little pointer there that shows where the dam is, completely covered in ice and snow prior to runoff last year. Next slide, please. This is our hydrographers right after they measured the record snowpack at Mammoth Pass. The metal tube they're holding on top of the snowcat there is a 21-foot long tube that was used to measure that snowpack. So that length was required because of how deep the snow was then, and that measurement resulted in 104 inches of snow water equivalent at Mammoth Pass. Next slide, please. So here we can talk about our water supply by year types within the aqueduct system. Our water supply consists of surface water runoff, pumped groundwater, and flowing groundwater. Usually the majority of the water is made up of the surface water runoff, but it varies year by year. Drier years, more of it is flowing groundwater and pumped groundwater, where in wet years it's more surface water runoff. In our dry year types, we have about 325,000 acre feet of supply. A normal year, we have 550,000 acre feet of supply. In our wet years, 760,000 acre feet of supply. And in our wet years, we're scrambling to spread and try to recharge the groundwater tables in the Owens Valley and supply as much water as we can through the aqueduct. And then you can see 2023 was 1 million acre feet, which is quite a bit higher than what we're used to even in wet years. Next slide, please. So where did the water go? We had 350,000 acre feet delivered to the Los Angeles Aqueduct to the city of LA. We have Eastern Sierra obligations, and this is made up of agreements and other obligations in Eastern Sierra related to the Inyo LA Water Agreement, environmental projects, mitigations, and also delivery to the Owens Lake dust mitigation projects, and that was about 170,000 acre feet. We had productive water spreading this last year was 210,000 acre feet. We added 70,000 acre feet to our reservoir storage this last year. And then the last two items are items that we try to avoid. It's water released outside of the aqueduct system, which is 40,000 acre feet, and water released to Owens Lake Brine Pool, which is 160,000 acre feet. And usually when we have numbers in those categories, it means our system was completely overwhelmed. We had nowhere else to put the water, and that's where it ended up. We also really try to avoid sending water to the Owens Lake Brine Pool because we have a lot of dust mitigation infrastructure at Owens Lake. We've spent over $2 billion constructing and maintaining the infrastructure at Owens Lake to control the dust around there. And when the brine pool fills up too much, it can flood into the dust control areas and cause damage to that infrastructure. Next slide, please. So some of the challenges we faced this year were that the late snowfall left only a short time frame to prepare for runoff. We had a rain on snow event in March that damaged the Los Angeles Aqueduct and other infrastructure. We had to obtain spreading permits from California Department of Fish and Wildlife, Bureau of Land Management, U.S. Forest Service. However, this particular challenge wasn't as difficult as it has been in the past. We had emergency declarations for the city of LA and other areas in California, and all of these agencies worked very well with us to help us obtain those permits in a pretty speedy manner. That helped us react quicker to the conditions that happened last year. So that was appreciated. So even though it's on the list of challenges, it was something that was not too difficult to overcome. We had some reservoir challenges. We knew that the inflows were going to exceed the outlet capacities at Denham Dam, and that Long Valley Reservoir was going to be crucial to storing as much water possible on this last year. So I have some items to talk about on that a little bit later. And then finally, when we made it through the runoff year, we got hit by Tropical Storm Hilary, which caused a bunch of damage again to our aqueduct system. One of the challenges I just mentioned in the slide before was just trying to prevent water going to the Owens Lake Brine Pool. It's not on this list here, but really trying to send as much water as possible to the city of LA, spread as much water as we could throughout the system to recharge the groundwater was trying to avoid that water going to Owens Lake. Next slide, please. So here we have our Eastern Sierra current precipitation conditions. This is something that gets put out every week or two during the winter months to kind of keep everyone in our organization informed of where we are for snow and water supply for the next year that will result from that snow. This was December 27th, 2022. You can see the red line was the current conditions at the time. The other lines are various years. We kind of compare to dry years and wet years. The dashed black line is what normal conditions are, and the green line was the wettest year on record at that time. And you can see by the end of December, we were barely above normal, really had no thoughts of having to deal with a large runoff year. We were at 10 inches of water content at that point. Next slide, please. By the end of January, we were at 37 inches of water content. We're looking at one of our wet year conditions. We were in full mode to prepare for runoff spreading, prepare our spreading grounds, make sure all our infrastructure was ready to handle it, and so forth. Next slide, please. By the end of February, we were approaching the record year. We're at 47 inches of water content. We knew things were going to be extremely challenging for the year. However, March was even worse. Next slide, please. In March alone, we got 100% of normal snowpack, which means if we had no snow the rest of the year, just March would have gave us a normal year. It shattered the previous record. We were at 68.6 inches of water content. And this really sent us scrambling, especially with the March rain on snow event, which I'll talk about next. Next slide, please. So this was some of the preparations that we were making leading into the year. We had made great progress by the March rain on snow event. we felt like we were going to be ready, no problem, before it happened, before the runoff came down, and we were be able to handle all the spreading we needed to do and so forth. And in March 11th, we had a rain event on about 3 feet of snow throughout the Owens Valley. That rain was pretty warm. It melted that snow, and not only was the rain pretty significant, but the snow melting added to that. And we had flooding throughout the aqueduct system that caused a lot of damage. Next slide, please. So here's one of the examples. We had mudslides that were filling overheads, and it flowed into the aqueduct. Next slide. We had roads washed out. The valley floor in the Owens Valley is mostly owned by the city of LA and Department of Water and Power. And these roads we used to access our facilities to be able to operate the aqueduct. We're also responsible for maintaining them and repairing them. So we had a lot of roads that we had to fix so that we could operate the aqueduct properly for the upcoming year at this point. Next slide, please. We had flumes and other measuring devices damaged as well, which makes it a little more difficult to manage the water when we can't tell how much is coming into the system. You can see here we had water washing around the measuring structure and right through it, and caused extensive damage and made it inoperable for the year. Next slide, please. Also on that same rain on snow event, the Los Angeles Aqueduct had a failure. We had a washout behind the panels here that it washed out a bunch of the sediment, caused the panels to fall out, and we had to shut down the aqueduct to get repairs done. Next slide, please. Our construction crews worked around the clock and finished the repair on March 13th, 2 days later. In the middle photo, you can see some of the earthwork that was done after the panels were repaired and getting it prepared to place shotcrete on the repair area. On the right, you can see the shotcrete repair in place before we turn the aqueduct back on. Next slide, please. So by March 18th, we had the aqueduct back in service. You can see the repair here. However, throughout the aqueduct, we had a large setback through a lot of our operational structures. All the preparations we had made from January and February through the first portion of March were erased, and we had to scramble to get ready for the runoff. And it really necessitated our crews to work 6 to 7 days a week, 12-hour days from March all the way through September to be able to handle the runoff, prepare for the runoff, handle the runoff, and then later on to respond to the Hurricane Hilary damage. Next slide, please. I mentioned earlier we had some preparations for our dams. On the left-hand side, you see the Tinnemaha Dam siphons with a modification we made to the dam to prepare for the runoff. The outlet capacity at Tinnemaha Dam was about 1,400 CFS, but we knew the inflows into Tinnemaha were going to exceed 2,000 CFS. This dam has got a California state restriction on safe limit on this dam, and we didn't really want it full the whole summer. We also had some concerns about the spillway. It had a lot of sediment in it that might wash into our aqueduct system downstream. So we felt that it would be prudent to install siphons over the dam and run those siphons to prevent higher levels in Tinnemaha from occurring during the year and from having to use the spillway. And these siphons effectively increased our outflow from 1,400 CFS to 2,000 CFS and allowed us to manage the reservoir so that we didn't run it too high and didn't have to use the spillway for the year. On the right-hand side, you can see Long Valley Dam modifications where we put boards in the spillway structure to raise the elevation by 3 feet and help us manage the water for the summer as well. Next slide, please. So we made it through the year. We get through our main runoff. We're able to manage everything. We thought everything was going well. And then Tropical Storm Hilary hit and caused damage all over again. And this happened throughout the aqueduct system, even though I only have a couple examples here because I don't have too much time to talk about it. So next slide, please. This is a photo of Whitney Portal Road and the damage caused there. Although this is not a LADWP road, it is a county road that is extensively used by our forces to access the structures on Lone Pine Creek. And I think this thing's something similar. This might be showed by Mike a little bit later, but extensive amount of damage right by Lone Pine, and also prevented access to Mount Whitney for people, or at least they had to use different roads to get there. Next slide, please. This is an example of some more damage at Division Creek. We have spreading structures along Division Creek, as well as a hydroelectric generation plant, and some of the damage that occurred along there. And this is, again, just an example. We have about 50 different structures that were either damaged or wiped out or buried in sediment that we've been working on fixing. We're still working on fixing it now, and we'll continue to be making repairs through probably fall of this year until we get all this damage repaired. Next slide, please. So I'm back to the slide on where the water went, and I kind of want to focus on a couple of things. One is the productive water spreading we were able to do this year, and the other is some of the water that we don't really consider productive. This is the water released outside the aqueduct system and the water released to the Owens Lake Brine Pool. Next slide, please. Our productive water spreading is mainly done in the Owens Valley, and this is just an example of spreading areas where we put water out in ponds, and it allows the water to infiltrate into the ground and recharge the groundwater. Next slide, please. So this is on the right-hand side, you see an image of the Owens Valley itself, and we have mountains on either side with a very flat floor, and that flat floor is where we're trying to do our water spreading. And that spreading mainly occurs in the Owens Valley. And LAUP has pumping wells located in the Owens Valley to pump water for aqueduct supply. We tried to minimize it this last year. We pumped very little except for obligated uses under the NELA agreement. We had to provide uses for like irrigation or other environmental projects. In wet years like this last year, the groundwater levels are restored through spreading that water. And between April 1, 2023 and February 1st, 2024, the groundwater levels rose an average of 3.2 feet within the well field areas in the Owens Valley. And that covers approximately 200,000 acres. And not all of that was because of our water spreading activities. We did have a lot of rain this last year. Typically, we get about 5.5 inches on average in the Owens Valley, and we had about 17 inches. But the spreading we did do really helped increase those groundwater levels and helped us store a lot of that water. Next slide, please. So for the water released to the Owens Lake Brine Pool, here we have a photo of Owens Lake. The upper portion is the Owens Lake Brine Pool. In the lower portion, you see one of our dust control areas. It's put in place some shallow flooding and islands and things, and the islands are there to promote waterfowl use. But the shallow flooding is done to prevent dust blowing off of Owens Lake. And as that brine pool fills up, well, we were concerned that it would flood into those areas and destroy that infrastructure. So we had an emergency contract put in place to raise the roads and berms along our dust control areas that separate the dust control areas from the brine pool by about 3 feet this year. And through our water management activities and those emergency measures, we were able to prevent water from the brine pool running into the dust control areas and causing damage. One note on that is we released 160,000 acre feet to the Owens Lake Brine Pool, but what you're seeing right here in this photo is about 50,000 acre feet. We have a lot of evaporation that happens from this lake, and about 110,000 of it has evaporated off already. And during the summer, it's a lot larger amounts of evaporation than during the winter. So it's been pretty constant at about this level of cool since the fall. Next slide, please. So just to sum up, water that we left on the table was about 200,000 acre feet that was released to the Owens Lake Brine Pool, and water that was released outside the aqueduct system. Water that was not put to beneficial use, and had we had infrastructure in place or ways to store that water or groundwater banking, we would have been able to handle that additional water and make good use of it. A lot of that water that was released to the Owens Lake Brine Pool was released through the Lower Owens River. And I think our next speaker, Mike Prather, is going to discuss those flows in the Lower Owens River and some of the effects from that. So Mike, if you're ready, I'll hand it off to you.
Mike, are you ready with your presentation? There we go. Thank you.
Okay, I think Mike is here now. I've lived in the Owens Valley in Lone Pine since 1980. I've been in Inyo County for about 50 years. I've been involved with conservation work all during that time, but especially here in the Owens Valley, I've been involved a lot with land and water issues. And in Owens Valley, that means that you spend a lot of time meeting and speaking with Los Angeles Department of Water and Power. This is a photo taken of Owens Lake, showing the brine pool from a different angle than Eric showed. This is an amazing thing to see. In the far distance in the center is Telescope Peak and Death Valley National Park, and then this incredible large saline terminal lake here of Owens Valley, or of Owens Lake, sorry. And Patsiata is the name used by the local indigenous people. Next slide. This is the same slide that Eric had. It is dramatic. We didn't compare notes before we did this presentation. Just simply suffice it to say that every single agency and entity had damage from all of the water we had in the various events throughout the past year. Next slide, please. The Owens River the lower Owens River was re-watered as part of the 1991 Inyo County, Los Angeles water agreement. This is a mitigation for unquantifiable pumping, groundwater pumping over the years, starting in 1970 when there were dramatic instances of damage, environmental damage in the Owens Valley from groundwater pumping by the city of Los Angeles to fill the second aqueduct. The loss of major springs like Fish Springs and Black Rock, and the loss of irrigated areas and natural wetlands. So 62 miles of the river, that much of it had been dry since 1913, were rewatered with the hopes of creating a warm water fishery and good riparian habitat. But this past year, the water ran quite high. As you can see, this is water going over Highway 136, which is the route to Death Valley from Lone Pine. It was more like sheet flooding, but the whole floodplain was completely covered. It was dramatic. It was and some of these times, I think going over this high water was as much as Eric can maybe help me on this, 1,100 cubic feet a second going over there. So this was closed for a period of weeks. But the beauty of this and the value of it, and to the value of for the fishery and the riparian is that this water volume brought the river out of her banks, and a lot of nutrients were lifted, spread across the floodplain along with seeds of willow and other native plants. This is something that we don't see in the normal rewatering protocols for the lower Owens River. There are flows that are set, a base flow of 40 cubic feet a second, and then in normal years and up to wet years, the flows can go up to 200 cubic feet a second. But here was 1,100 cubic feet a second water going across the floodplain. So it was just a beautiful thing to see, something that used to occur every wet year, but something that hasn't been seen just a handful of times since the completion of the Los Angeles Aqueduct. One concern here is that there was a lot of work done by Los Angeles and Inyo County on removing the invasive salt cedar or tamarisk along this 62-mile stretch of river. And there's concern that we may see quite an eruption of them. We'll have to wait and see, but they are very aggressive. I believe Los Angeles has set aside some money to fund some of the removal of tamarisk along here since the floods. Next slide, please. Well, there was an abundance of water going into Owens Lake. There were impacts to the habitat and dust control infrastructure that Eric alluded to, and that's not a good thing. The habitat in the dust project is superb and internationally known and valued. Owens Lake is part of a network of reserves extending from the high Arctic all the way to Patagonia and Tierra del Fuego. Just the sheer numbers of birds, hundreds of thousands, has made the return to the lake somewhat accidentally. It was started with a dust project. Now it's a habitat and dust project. So there were good things and bad things about the water coming up high. There were recreational activities in terms of being able to go out and paddle or do some birding. There's been some waterfowl hunters also out there. But when it gets too high and starts to impinge on the habitat dust control areas, the infrastructure there, then there are problems. Normally in the habitat dust control area, most of the cells, these polygons that you can see on Google Earth, they are dried out during the summer. But this year, all through the summer and into the fall, there was water everywhere, simply because the water had to go somewhere. There's such a volume of water. It couldn't get rid of enough of it. It's like Eric said, water was being spilled south of the Owens Valley, into the Indian Wells Valley, into the Antelope Valley. We want that water to stay up here in the future, in the Owens Valley and in Mono County as well, more in Mono Lake, so we can raise the level vertically there to meet some of the goals, and actually so LA could actually take more water if they could reach some of those goals of raising Mono Lake. We'd like less groundwater pumping as well, particularly in the dry years. Okay, next slide, please. Well, here's some of the recreationists. This is quite a brain trust there. We have the policy director of the Friends of the River, the fellow in the front with the paddle, Peter Vorster, a very notable hydrologist, and then professors emeritus of different universities and other people working on rivers around the state of California. They came in October and we paddled the lake. The brine pool covers about 50% of the lake's surface. The other 50% roughly is the habitat dust control project. There were birds that used the brine pool. It is very briny. It was filled with brine shrimp and a bloom of green algae. But there were birds using it. Not numbers like you see in the habitat dust control area by any means, but it was being used. Next slide, please. In the future, we'd like to see not only the current spreading by DWP continue, but try to find additional areas in the Owens Valley or in the Eastern Sierra, possibly enlarge Crowley Lake by raising the Long Valley Dam, finding ways anywhere, any corners where we can keep more water up here and not have it spill on the way to Los Angeles. This would, in the valley, would allow water tables to rise and support the native vegetation, some of which is still not in really good shape. Some of those water tables are down since the late 1980s, when as much as 200,000 acre feet of water were pumped annually. Since the Inyo County Water Agreement with LA, the pumping has been greatly reduced and has remained fairly steady in the mid 70s to 80,000 acre-feet a year since 1991. I'd like to also see more water, seasonal water, summer and fall out on Owens Lake in the habitat dust control area for the birds from the far north, the thousands and thousands of them that are coming through looking for a place to rest and to forage. I had a couple of things I had scribbled down here. Cleaning up the San Fernando aquifer, San Fernando Valley aquifer would be a tremendous benefit for everybody. If that aquifer could be used and not be filled with solvents and other things, and I know work is being done, but I don't know the status currently, how many wells are available, et cetera. But if that water could be stored there, in dry years, pumping could be reduced up here, and that would have great benefit here locally. In the future, we'd also like to see Los Angeles changes its definition of local water. Currently, they want to, in the future, use mostly local water. They're including the Eastern Sierra as local water, which is somewhat disingenuous. They do own or have the right, I should say, the permission to use that water, but it's far from local as it goes, 240 miles to the south. So taking the Eastern Sierra out of the local water description would be greatly appreciated and beneficial up here. Next slide. And that's my last one. That's a young bull tule elk walking through some of the habitat dust control areas at Owens Lake. This is looking south towards the Coso Mountains wilderness area and the Southern Sierra. So thank you very much. I really appreciate being here.
All right. Well, I'd like to thank all of our speakers before we get started with our question and answer session right now. I think, Gary, if you could put up the slides, just a reminder for how we handle the Q&A. I'll be reading off the questions in the order that they're received. And I know that our first question was answered in writing, but I'm going to go ahead and ask it again because we do have some people that are participating by phone, and I want to make sure that they hear the answers to their questions, hear the questions and the answers to the questions. So you use the Q&A, please, and you can upvote a question as Connor described. And with that, let's go ahead and move forward with the Q&A. Our first question was about the price of desalinated water, and it was a question for Dan Denham. So Dan, could you respond to that so others can hear the answer?
Yeah, thanks, Dee. So the cost per acre foot for this past fiscal year was $3,300 an acre foot.
And we're talking about ocean desal there, which I think most people expected based on your presentation, but there is a gambit between what would be groundwater desal versus ocean desal. All right, the next question that we have is also for Dan, and it's from Edith de Guzman. And she's asking suggesting that San Diego will likely be the bellwether for other SoCal agencies with reduced per capita demand, but increasing per unit costs for ratepayers as system upgrade costs stack up. And what advice do you have for navigating this reality as agencies invest in potable reuse projects?
Yeah, I think that's a great observation and one that we've been looking at over more than the past 5 years. I'd say arguably the past 10. As our customers have become more efficient, as the question notes, per capita water use has gone down, and we had sort of been in this mindset that there would always be a rebound. If you look at our past urban water management plans, and I know that the Water Authority is not the only one in this situation, but as planners, I think we go back to the idea of rebounding to a trend line. Well, that trend line has been inaccurate for, I think, the past 5 to 10 years. And what we're seeing is this downward trend in water use. And so it's compounding the problem. But I think really what it speaks to is that as an industry, we've been sort of conditioned to think about dry year planning, which I think is appropriate. And as I kind of noted in the presentation, the next drought, it's coming. I think that we all know that. But if you look at things in maybe 10-year increments, maybe 2 of those years, like I think we're going to experience this time around, they'll be wet, right? And so what do you do in those high runoff years or in those years of abundance? I think some of that speaks to storage. The Water Authority has increased its largest surface water storage reservoir. It's doubled it in size. But again, the Water Authority, like others in the Met service area in California, in 2 years, we're realizing that those surface water storage reservoirs are pretty full. And I think you saw some of the graphics there. So what does that speak to next? I'll pivot back to some of the stuff that I had in the presentation, which is flexibility and the sharing of resources. If our reservoirs are full or we don't have the demands for the investments that we've made, whether it's in the Colorado River supplies or the Carlsbad desal plant, perhaps there's another partner in Southern California or in the lower basin that we can exchange supplies with, who isn't quite on the same investment cycle as the Water Authority. And what I mean by that is that what we did was a buildup of 25 years worth of supply development to get to the point where we are today, where we do have supplies that can be managed in a different way.
Thank you, Dan. And that original question was from Jack Humphreyville. And I went back to check that and I realized I skipped over another question that I got moved into the answered column. And that's from John Munson, who is asking for San Diego, what percentage of your water goes to agriculture, residential, industrial, or other, or however you break it down. So you answered that, but if you could do it verbally for us, Dan, we'd appreciate it.
Yeah, so our breakdown is 62% residential, 22% commercial and industrial, 6% ag, and 10% public and other. I think that the color that I would add to that is that the Water Authority does have a special agricultural water rate program, and that's what that 6% figure represents. There are some growers in San Diego that use the full treated and untreated water rate in our service area. We don't track that, however, but that's sort of embedded in the commercial and industrial number. We have about 1,500 customers enrolled in our special agricultural water rate program.
Okay, thank you, Dan. This next question is for Eric, and it comes from Maureen Glenchie. And the question is, what are LA Aqueduct interconnections, actual or planned, with the East Branch of the California Aqueduct and Antelope Valley groundwater recharge facilities? Do those interconnections provide DWP the opportunity in very wet years to optimize its use of Eastern Sierra water through transfers and exchanges?
Okay, thank you, Dee. While we're open to exchanges and transfers there, and we have thought about interconnections there, our focus right now is more on groundwater banking along the aqueduct system between South Haywee and the filtration plant, as well as additional opportunities in the Owens Valley, as Mike mentioned earlier, he'd like to see. And that's mainly so far because during wet years, a lot of the other agencies also have a lot of water, and it's difficult to put together transfers during those times. So for now, our focus is going to be on being able to store our aqueduct water ourselves along the aqueduct system somewhere. And as groundwater banking is developed further within the state of California and other people are able to store that water, maybe the transfers and exchanges will be something that'll be more attractive to us.
Thank you, Eric. Mike, do you want to respond to that question as well?
No, I think that Eric did a good job on that.
Okay, all right. Well, then the next question is also for Eric, and this is from Lauren Kelly. Lauren's asking, where was the water released that was released outside of the aqueduct system?
Okay, I think Mike answered this a little bit too in his talk, but we released it, that's south of South Haywee. We have just covered conduits and pipeline siphons going to Los Angeles. And the water released from the aqueduct there, we consider outside of our system because we can't recover it. And that was in the Indian Wells Valley near Ridgecrest, as well as Antelope Valley, and a lot of water was released near Mojave as well. So almost all of the water that was outside the aqueduct system was along that area.
Mike, do you want to add anything?
No, just that, again, we hope we get to a time where we can, have more water recharged in San Fernando Valley and be able to fully use that aquifer and also expand and keep water up in the Eastern Sierra. And, you know, I'm an Inyo County person, but we're connected with LA, we're connected with our brothers and sisters in Mono County, and try to keep as much water in the Eastern Sierra as possible.
All right, thank you, Mike. The next comment we have is a compliment from Diane Wallace, just thanking gentlemen for the photos, which she said are particularly helpful in the presentations today. So I want to make sure you see that. Okay, the next question is from Greg Reese, and he's asking what species of brine shrimp is in the Owens Lake? Mike, I'm going to send that to you, but it may have some comments there too.
Well, all I can say for Greg, and hi Greg, by the way, is that the brine shrimp were shoulder to shoulder in October. I mean, there were just trillions of them out there. I have to honestly say I don't know the species, whether it's the same as from Mono Lake. I've heard that it is a different species, but I don't know which one. I have to call the Mono Lake Committee or call Fish and Wildlife in Bishop and find out. Let me know.
All right. Okay, our next question is for both the San Diego County Water Authority and for Eric. So that's Dan and Eric. And it deals with groundwater extraction limitations in our groundwater basins, including in the LADWP service area. I think this was alluded to by Mike a minute ago. Due to water quality constraints. Do those constraints inhibit recharging water to them? I'm going to start with Eric, and then Dan, you might want to talk about what opportunities for groundwater recharge there are in your service area.
So LADWP does have some restrictions in the San Fernando Valley due to water quality issues, and we have a few groundwater remediation projects coming online within the next year. We'll restore the beneficial use of our groundwater basin there. And did I answer the whole question with that one?
Yeah, I think the question is just, do you have water quality constraints that are inhibiting or limiting your ability to store more water in groundwater basins and in particular in your service area?
And that's in the service area. So I think I answered the question.
Okay,
Dan.
go ahead, Dan.
I think I get a get out of jail free card with that graphic that I showed earlier, because San Diego has very, very little groundwater to speak of. And so when water is in abundance and recharge is possible, it's not really an option for our region and our service area.
Interesting.
I'll just add from Metropolitan's perspective, we sort of have a backbone system in the service area, and we are trying to facilitate groundwater storage where it's possible throughout the Southern California region, and have been working on different programs, as was discussed in our previous meeting, in order to try to facilitate that.
Good.
Okay, so let's go on to Tony Wilkinson's question. He asked about the slide decks. So they'll be shared and accessed online as always for Southern California Water Dialogue. It takes a couple of days for us to get those posted, but both the slide decks and the video of this presentation and the Q&A will be provided to the public and posted there. Okay, and Tony's got a hello for you, John Munson there. So I'll let you read that if you can. Click on your Q&A because that seems more personal than for the group. Isabel de Vivier, I hope I got your name pronounced right. Isabel is asking about the areas where water overflowed the banks of the aqueduct. Is it possible to naturalize these areas into habitat areas where excess water is allowed to overflow rather than rearmoring the aqueduct in those locations? So Eric, this is for you. Oh, maybe Mike, you have some thoughts too.
I can speak to that too. You know, it's always a good idea when you get something back that turns green and you get some dragonflies showing up. That's always wonderful. But, you know, a lot of the places along the aqueduct are really desert scrub habitat, and they really haven't been in a native sense or traditional sense, you know, a meadow or a wetland. I think for me, it's better to focus on where are the areas where we can get the best bang for the buck or drop of water. Owens Lake is certainly one of them, and Mono Lake. Those are the places that have traditionally been these rich areas, just areas of like I said, international importance, and that's where we want. I think that's where the water's best spent.
Eric, did you want to offer anything more?
I think Mike answered that well. If there is excess water, it should be located in areas that provide the best habitat.
Okay, thank you. All right, Dan, this one's from Jack Humphreyville to you, I think, because it's asking about the status of the litigation between San Diego and Metropolitan. Maybe a little bit off topic for today's discussion. He's asking what's the basis of the litigation, and since we are collaborating on this project, maybe there's the tie-in.
Yeah, I mean, I guess the short answer is that it's ongoing, but I would say that the litigation is not what it used to be. I think that the relationship has fundamentally changed between the Water Authority and Metropolitan, certainly between, you know, my board and the Met board and myself and Adele Hodge-Khalil. You know, that I think that, just to be candid with all of you, there are certain components of the litigation that have to find their way eventually in appeals to the courts. But I sincerely want to tell you that we're working together, myself and Adele and our boards, on ending that and reaching a settlement.
Very good, thanks, Dan. Okay, Charming Evelyn has the next question. Eric, I think we've talked about this a little bit, but do you want to offer anything more on why excess water isn't being put into the spreading grounds in Owens Valley? Or do we feel like we've already answered this question?
That's all right. I can elaborate a little bit.
Okay.
I think we did put as much as we could into the spreading grounds in the Owens Valley this year. I think what's being discussed is groundwater banking opportunities along the aqueduct in the Owens Valley, and why would it not be put in the Owens Valley rather as along the aqueduct. And any groundwater banking plans that we have are just going to be the ones that make the most sense business-wise for us, and whether that's in the Owens Valley or along the aqueduct remains to be determined. And we're going to try to prioritize the Owens Valley, but we're going to explore all options and see what makes the most sense for us.
There may be, I can't remember, Eric, on this. I'm certainly not a legal mind, but there may be a question about the water agreement and storing water outside of Inyo County, the water agreement between Inyo and LA. I haven't heard any rumblings about that, and I don't know for sure. But do you know if that's going to be a bump in the road at all?
I'm not aware of anything like that, but there is in the NELA water agreement provision for groundwater banking, but it's somewhat vague. So in talks between the Inyo County and Los Angeles, we'll have to work that out and see what that means for both sides.
Been there on many other issues. We've all grown gray together, right?
All right, thanks, gentlemen. All right, Dan, our next question is from Evelyn Wendell with WeTap. And she's asking if you can share some out-of-the-box public communication projects you have that are effective to help you share priorities and goals for the future.
Yeah, so two separate and perhaps unrelated things come to mind. One has to do with affordability, and the other has to do with some of our regional infrastructure. In terms of affordability, I think that's become part of everyone's narrative, as has climate change. And in many ways, I think the two are interrelated. I think, you know, a few years back, we're sort of attempting to tackle this at the retail level. But I think intuitively, it can't just be done at the retail level. It has to be supported at the wholesale, which is what we are at the San Diego County Water Authority. And then, you know, to use the overused analogy of a three-legged stool, I'll go with a four-legged stool and say that you have to have the wholesale, you have to have the retail, and you have to have the state and federal government as part of any balancing equation to affordability. I think that so much of the investments that have been made over the past couple of decades have been balanced on the backs of ratepayers, and that's why we are feeling and why we are hearing what we're hearing from folks that quite candidly have rate fatigue. I think that we need the level of investment at the federal level, like what we got more recently with the Inflation Reduction Act funding that helped facilitate that multi-beneficial transaction between metropolitan San Diego and Imperial Valley. More of that, I think, is going to help us all reduce costs and better manage water. On the public infrastructure side of the equation, I think that a real push for us, we're going into our next rate setting cycle here within the next couple of weeks. And I think it's everyone's sort of opinion, or at least a lot of people's go-to as well. Cut your CIP, reduce your projects, don't build anything. That's sort of take on how to reduce costs. Of course, you can reduce costs in other ways and smaller ways through your operating budget, but really a lot of the times your backbone infrastructure and how you spend your capital, your debt is a big piece of your rates. I say all that because we've got to be very cautious about getting into a situation where we are deferring maintenance, especially at our level, at the wholesale water level with the Water Authority, with Metropolitan and other wholesalers. You know, pipe breaks on the retail level, they will typically flood out a number of households. You could have, you know, 100 or so people out of water. When some of the pipes break that we have, the pipes that you can walk through, those wipe out freeways, those wipe out homes and cause significant problems, water outages for not just days, but weeks and perhaps months at a time. So being able to communicate that message to folks that as a baseline consideration in what you pay for water, it's regional infrastructure reliability is, I think, becoming more and more important. And I think that that's a challenge that we're faced with in San Diego at the Water Authority and with, you know, many others as we look to raising rates in an environment of extreme rate fatigue.
Thank you, Dan. Also, all good points that we are challenged with right now. I'm going to shift to the next question. This is also from Lauren Kelly, who, by the way, appreciated your response earlier, Eric. Our follow-up question, or I should say, Lauren's follow-up question, is that are there currently plans for building new water storage areas or spreading grounds in the Owens Valley? Who is in charge of making those decisions?
Okay. So yes, there are plans in place for that. We've already shared plans for our first project with Inyo County, which is a pilot project near what's called Cottonwood Spillgates. It's just west of the Owens Lake. And that pilot project is going to consist of putting some water out in the area we think might be a good candidate and finding out what the infiltration rates are into the ground and how well the groundwater levels hold up underneath that area once it does infiltrate as well. And that'll kind of help us determine whether it actually is as promising of an area as we think it is. And who is in charge of making those decisions? It's really our general manager and water system managers who make those decisions. The Aqueduct system will provide ideas on request or as we see need. And so right now we're moving forward with that first pilot project.
I wonder, Eric, Oh, I'm sorry.
I was saying, go ahead, Mike, sorry.
Sorry. Um, just to follow up on Eric's, I wonder if it's possible or conceivable that if a new area could be found, say down in that Cottonwood area on the west shore of Owens Lake, that's really good ground there, it seems like. But if we could increase it, could we possibly take some of the pressure off a well field or two, because we have like 8 or 9 well fields in the Owens Valley, and a couple of them are hit more than or used more than others. The Big Pine area has quite a bit of use there for various reasons. It'd be nice if we could reduce that. And then there's an area called Laws where there's just been vegetation devastation over the decades. It'd be neat to someday just be able to turn that well field off, or run the McNally ditches to infiltrate that Laws area. Eric, your thoughts on that at all?
So this is really about being able to store water in wet years for maybe the following dry year. We don't think it's going to be a long-term thing, but we also feel that I think we have a little difference of opinion sometimes that the well fields are doing pretty well, and that the groundwater levels, they're higher than they've been since early 1970s when we started pumping at this point. And I know it's right after a very wet year, but I think we've done a good job of managing the groundwater levels in the Owens Valley for quite a long time now. And we'll have to see how water supply sorts out for the city in the future. I think we'll just have to see how those things go. And if we see, of course, under the Inyo Water Agreement, we're not allowed to cause damage to the vegetation through our pumping. Otherwise, it has to be mitigated. So we're always going to try to pump our well fields to avoid any damage to vegetation.
Right. Those water tables that went down a lot in the 87 and 88 and whatnot, they went down drastically. Those were the couple of years where 200,000 or more acre feet were pumped in a single year. Are you familiar with whether those have also returned? That was an average you gave, 3.2 feet throughout all the well fields in the valley, or 200,000 acres, but that can smooth out some of the bumps sometimes.
Yeah, it can, but my understanding is that they have recovered, but now they might be slightly below the peak in the 1980s. But when I'm talking about 1970 on, you're looking at the effects of pumping. Overall, we've maintained groundwater levels in the Owens Valley throughout that time.
It'd be nice to have the groundwater levels so high that Fish Springs and Black Rock Springs would start running again.
Yeah, I think part of it is that when you hit a drought, those areas would still dry up during those droughts, and that's why Big Pine has to be pumped quite a bit. So I think unless something changes for as far as our mitigation is, we have to pump those wells for Fish Springs, Fish Hatchery, and until that changes, we'll be continuing to allow Fish and Wildlife to do that pumping.
Well, we did reduce. There was a reduction of 1/3, I think, at Black Rock, which I think raised some of at the hatchery at Black Rock, which allowed groundwater to rise there years ago. That was associated with that dispute between Inyo and LA. Is there any chance that the hatchery at Fish Springs could also be reduced in the future? The pumping?
Eric, could you respond to that? And then I think we've got a few more questions I just want to make sure we get to before we end today.
Okay, thank you. There is talks going on between us and Fish and Wildlife to reduce that, to try to get the pumping down to just what's needed for raising fish. And that involves, we've done some design work for them so they can install some valves to be able to control. Right now it's only on or off, so they really are on all the time.
Right.
And once that happens, they should be able to reduce it somewhat during their off seasons, but I don't think it's a drastic reduction. I think it's 20% during certain times of the year.
Thank you.
Okay, very good. So Tony Wilkinson has a question that has to do with the Eastern San Fernando Valley groundwater area for storage. And he notes that the storage is critical for DWP's project to reuse water from the Hyperion water treatment plant. So it doesn't have a large future available capacity is the concern. And he wants to know what, Eric, you have to say about that. Is this a challenge that you'll have competing resources to put into the ground in the San Fernando Valley?
Yes, I think that would be the case. I think the reuse project he's talking about is our Operation Next, which is a plan to be able to reuse or recycle a lot of water within the city of LA. And our master plan is currently in progress for that. We're evaluating alternatives. That master plan should be completed at the end of the year. And part of it will be using the San Fernando Basin to take some of that reused water, inject it into the ground. So that would compete with aqueduct water when it's available to send there. And that's also a reason why we're exploring groundwater baking throughout the aqueduct system in Indian Valley.
Thanks, Eric. This next comment and question is also from Tony Wilkinson, and Dan and Eric, it's for both of you. So Dan, he says, your comments about affordability are spot on. Many environmental goals have been pursued with the idea that ratepayers are an unending source of funding. In Los Angeles, we have probably the poorest big city in America, many low-income areas in San Diego County also. So costs need to be considered for every environmental remedy that is proposed. He's asking for comments, and he acknowledges that you've already made some comments in this area. Also about the cost and location of off aqueduct storage.
I can start, and I'll just be very brief because I think I did answer a little bit of this, but I agree. The biggest reuse project in our service area that the city of San Diego has embarked upon was the result of regulations, and those are regulations that the city, rightfully so, has to comply with as it relates to discharge at the Point Loma wastewater treatment plant. But that is largely, again, being balanced on the backs of ratepayers and without much federal or state funding tied to the regulations. So it's certainly a challenge. I think that there's a paradox out there in our industry that we are tasked with doing environmentally sensitive projects such as reuse and other stormwater capture. But a lot of the times the folks that can't afford to pay for those are impacted the most. So it's a very challenging problem, I think, admittedly.
Thanks, Dan. Eric?
Yeah, definitely, Tony. Cost is a very important factor. I think it's something we're struggling with a little bit with our recycled water projects, as well as our reuse project for Operation Next. The costs are going to be very high, but there's goals the city of LA wants to meet to be able to try to transfer water use to local as much as possible. And those will be things we'll be trying to balance going into the future for sure. And as we look at different alternatives for our recycling and reuse projects.
Can I have a follow-up with Eric?
Sure. Go ahead, Mike.
At Owens Lake, where there's a mixed group of stakeholders that have been working together for 20 years, it seems like. We represent tribes, environmental groups, City of Los Angeles, Inyo County, the dust control office and all. We've agreed on goals, kind of the four-legged stool that Dan talked about. We need to control the dust at Owens Lake, and one of the tools is water, a major tool. We need to restore and maintain habitat that was there historically as part of public trust and whatnot. We need to protect cultural resources. And gosh, I'm sounding like that governor of Texas. I'm forgetting the fourth one. And we need to use water efficiently. So far, about 13,000 acre feet have been saved at Owens Lake. About about 65,000 to 75,000 acre feet per year are used for the Habitat Dust Control Project, but 13,000 acre feet have been saved, although that was before all hell broke loose and the skies opened. But so that was about a 20% saving. So that's a very laudable thing for those parties, those stakeholders to have come up with and supported and make happen.
Thank you, Mike. I thought there was going to be a question in there, but I appreciated the kind of the overview. Is there a question for Eric in there?
Oh, I think I let in with the wrong opening. I think it was time for Mike to speak. I guess I was jealous I was left out of
Well, we're glad to
I
have you.
crashed.
So, but that's a perfect segue for me because the last comment is from Grant Hogue complimenting you all for being so well spoken and representing diverse viewpoints. And I just, as I'm turning this back over to my colleague, Connor Everts, just like to ask if any of you have any summary comments you want to make about, what we're doing to try to take advantage of these really, really wet years in order to prepare for the future. So I'll leave you with that and invite Connor back. Thank you all very much.
Well, you're more than welcome. I think, can I speak? I can speak briefly.
Go ahead.
Oh, I'm sorry, Connor.
No, I'm saying, go ahead, Mike.
I'm poaching on your time.
No, you're not. I want you to finish.
I've seen over the years, I've lived here in Lone Pine and in the Eastern Sierra that Los Angeles at one time was on average having about 2/3 of their water come from the Eastern Sierra. And now on average, it's closer to 1/3. Long story, but a lot of water has remained up here and it's become obligations. And so I think Los Angeles has been open to, although sometimes we were in court, to try to balance things out and make things a little more environmental a little more like environmental justice in that. And I think they should get the credit. There's people that do not want to give Los Angeles DWP credit. If they hear their name, they want to pick up a bucket of rocks and start throwing rocks. And it is just unfair. So there's good progress that's been made up here. There's more progress that can take place. That's my feeling from the Eastern Sierra.
Okay. I see that we still have one more question coming in.
Oh.
And I want to be able to take that as well. So Dee's left it with me. Lauren Kelly says for Eric, does DWP have plans to reduce water extraction from the Owens Valley once LA builds up its local water sources? What are the next steps that LADWP wants to take once it builds up its own water resources?
Okay, well, the aqueduct is still going to be a crucial supply to the city of LA, even when reuse projects come online. When you're reusing water, you're still losing a little bit of that every year, and that 30% that the aqueduct supplies will help replenish those resources. There is no plans to reduce groundwater extraction. However, we always want to responsibly pump those well fields and make sure that we're not doing any damage to the vegetation or the environment in the Owens Valley. And when we prioritize things, we'll be taking that into account and the importance of treating the environment right and making sure the groundwater levels are healthy in the Owens Valley.
Thank you, Eric. It's some time to first thank all the presenters, Mike, Dan, and Eric, and some amazing photos. Makes me want to do a road trip up and actually see nature's full force and water on the lake that I've only seen from a hike up Whitney Portal. The opportunities here are difficult to say that we can ever capture everything that runs off. With the extremes of climate change, we're seeing both sides, as Dan mentioned, from driest 3 years to wettest. And we don't know what's left in this year, still to come, and a possible whiplash back to La Nina next year. So we always have to be planning, and the baseline's kind of gone out the window. I did want to say that the environmental regulations that were in place and some not fully realized aren't just back on the backs of the ratepayers. They're actually to the benefit of everyone if they're fully done. And if they're done right, like in conservation programs that can offset high rates, there's a benefit to both in the long run with water reliability as well. With that, I want to thank all of you that participated and asked questions. It was a good session, and we look forward to seeing you next month, March 27th, when we'll be talking about the LA County Water Plan and regional cooperation. Again, thanks to our planning committee, Kathy and Dee, and all of you. Good night and good luck.
Thank you.
Yeah.